Hello and welcome back. My name is Erin Ferguson, and this video is going to be a tutorial on drawing hands. For the sake of full disclosure, I suppose I should share that I am not an expert anatomist, but I have drawn a lot of hands, and I don't always get them right on the first go, but I have gotten to a point where I can usually make them pretty convincing, and so I thought I would make this tutorial sharing some of the tips and tricks that I have learned just through a lot of observation, and hopefully it'll be able to help you too. So let's go ahead and get started here. I have got Photoshop open, as you can see, with a whole bunch of reference images that I just straight up ripped off of Google. But most of these are just, photos of people doing regular everyday things with their hands. They are brushing their teeth, they are braiding their hair, buttoning a sleeve, drawing, sipping tea. I love this lady right here. And then I just grabbed a random reference pack that has some more sort of casual hand references in it. And I'm going to be using these to show some of my various tips and tricks. So my first tip is to look for finger clumps. And what I mean by that is to look for the ways that the fingers group. Now, obviously, that is going to vary from pose to pose and depending on how casual the hand gesture is or how forced it is, but I've noticed that in something like 80% of cases, fingers form themselves into three distinct clumps. So if this is our palm, they form themselves into one clump one group consisting of the thumb, another group often just consisting of our pointer finger or our index finger, and then the last three fingers, that's lovely right there. The last three fingers tend to all bunch together. Now this can vary. Sometimes clumps can be made up of, say, your thumb being one clump, your index finger and your middle finger being a clump, and then your ring finger and your pinky being a clump. But more often than not, I find that they separate themselves into these three groups: your thumb, your index, and then your last three. And I'll show you what I mean here. So if we look at these reference images I've pulled up, take a look at this dude brushing his teeth with all the watermarks on it, and take a look how these three fingers here are essentially doing the same thing. So we've got three fingers forming a clump, but then his index finger here is doing something else, and his thumb is doing something else. So we have one clump, and then two, and three. Again, we can take a look at this girl who's braiding her hair. These fingers are forming a clump, doing their own thing. So this is one clump. Then here we go, we've got our pointer finger here doing its own thing, and the thumb right here doing its own thing. Same thing here. This one's a little harder to see, but all three of these fingers are forming a clump. Then this one here, her pointer finger, is breaking that mold. It's coming toward us. And then we can assume that her thumb is there behind the hair. So we've got one clump, two clumps, and then her hidden thumb would be three. I'm assuming it's back here somewhere. Again, another girl braiding her hair. This is a good example. Again, one, two, three. And here would be an example where we have a slightly different clump variation, because these two fingers here are forming a clump, and these ones here are doing almost the exact same thing. One of them sort of bent up, one of them sort of bent down. And then of course we've got the thumb back there. So we have one, two, three. I would say, like I said before, I'd say 80% of the time these three fingers end up doing more or less the same thing, but every now and then it splits differently to where we've got sort of a 2 and 2. Same thing, this guy right here. Check out, these three fingers are essentially doing the same thing. This guy's doing something else, and this thumb is doing something else. So 1, 2, 3. Here's another example here of three fingers clumped, thumb's doing its own thing, and the pointer finger is almost mirroring these three, except that it's on top of the pencil instead of below. So we have 1, 2, and 3. So I think you get the idea. So when you are drawing a hand, a lot of times we get overwhelmed thinking we have all 5 fingers, to worry about. And that's just so many fingers going every which way. But in some ways you can think of it as only having maybe 3 fingers to worry about. Sometimes even less if you're forming like a fist. I don't know if I even pulled up a reference for a fist. I don't know if I did, but make a fist. Go ahead and make a fist. And really it's more like 2 because, your thumb will form 1 clump, and then your other, wow, that is beautiful, and then your other 4 fingers form another clump. Wow, that is the ugliest thing I've ever drawn. That's fine. But you see what I mean. So that forms one clump, and that forms 2. So when we think of the fingers as clumps as opposed to 5 separate digits, it really helps to draw the hand. It really helps to simplify the hand and makes it easier to draw. So my next tip has to do with the overall structure of the hand. So when you're drawing hands, it's really tempting to make the fingers very round, like sausages. But if you actually take a close look at hands, your fingers aren't really so much round as they are square, like long rectangular blocks. And you can actually, this is another tip I have for you too, is to trace over photos, and you'll see what I mean. So for example, if I look at this guy's hand right here, if I trace the structure of his knuckles, you can clearly see planes. The knuckle lines give us really distinct vanishing points that show us how those fingers turn into space. And you can use this to your advantage, especially when you're shading your drawing, because as you can see, they're very distinct. There's a very distinct like light plane on the top of his hand and a darker plane on the side. And it can help to break down the hand into boxes. Let's take another hand and do this really quick. Let's do this lady here. Again, this one's like super watermarked. But we can take the tops of her fingers and break them into very distinct planes by following those knuckle lines. You see how those turn into boxes? So rather than seeing fingers as these sausages that are just perched on the end of this wedge, you can almost think of them as being plugged in to the end of your hand. So if your palm is a wedge like this, with distinct side and top planes, I almost think of the top of your hand as having like little sockets, like you would plug in a phone charger or something. And your fingers, with their knuckles, fit on top, plug in right there almost like Legos. Now obviously this is pretty extreme, your fingers are more, slightly more rounded than this, but by breaking them down into really simple blocky shapes, you'll find that they're a lot easier to draw and a lot easier to shade too. Another thing I want to point out is wrist placement. It's really tempting when you're, drawing a hand, so here we go, let's draw another of my ugly hands, to slap the wrist right here in the middle of the hand. But if you'll look at some of these reference photos down here, you'll notice that the wrist is actually slightly offset. It cuts through your middle fingers, but your thumb is offset to the side. So your hand actually hangs over your wrist more on one side than the other. And you'll see, especially in cartoons and animation, sometimes they really push this a lot to where the hand is almost is almost twice as wide as the wrist. You'll see this if you ever take a look at like the hand references from like the Iron Giant what's the boy's name in that movie? Hogarth. His hand is it's about, 1, and the wrist is 2. I mean, it's almost twice as wide. And so you can push that too if you're going to cartoon. But even if you're not, just be aware that on one side, on your pinky side, your wrist lines up pretty well with the edge of your hand. But on the other side, it doesn't. Your thumb hangs over quite a bit. My next tip has to do with gesture. So it's really easy for hands to start to look very stiff, much like this one here. And as we discussed earlier, if you draw hands with clumped fingers, they tend to look much more natural. But something else I wanted to point out too is that the gesture of your arm into your wrist usually continues through your pointer finger. So on some of these references here, I'll show you, we can see the gesture of the arm and the wrist is followed through the pointer finger. It's like you can draw a line straight through it. Same thing here. The arm and the wrist goes through the pointer finger. This one's much more rigid. It just goes straight up through the pointer finger. This one right here. And so on and so forth. Here we go. Here's one with the fingers curled, but you can see the way the palm curls and it follows straight through the pointer finger. So in order to draw hands that look natural, they have to follow the natural curve of the arm and the wrist. So a lot of times it helps to draw your line of action first. So if I'm going to draw an arm, I'll first, sketch out a line of action, a way I want, my arm to go. And then I will follow that line of action with my pointer finger. The thumb can be doing something else, the other fingers can be doing something else, but that line of action is traced through that pointer finger. There we go. There's a super lanky arm. I actually do draw most of my limbs like super lanky. I usually have to rein it in a little bit. There we go. That's a little slightly more natural. You'll also notice that for a lot of casual sort of hand gestures, the fingers tend to turn in. They don't stick out straight like porcupine quills, like this ugly hand I keep drawing. They don't really stick out straight like that. In fact, they tend to curve in toward each other. So as we can see on this hand, how the fingers tend to curl in and sort of form almost like a cup shape. Same thing on this hand, the fingers curl in. And here they curl in. Your fingers are very rarely like super rigid and straight. This one's fairly straight. We're still getting a little bit of curl here, but that's more of a forced gesture, like if you were going to give somebody a high five. Whereas this one, being a little more casual, we can see the curl of the fingers right here. So just be aware of that. If your hands are looking really stiff, make sure that the fingers have sort of an organic curl to them. Also, when you're drawing hands, I would advise you to avoid adding too many lines unless the character is supposed to be old. So, of course, we can take any of these young, attractive people here, and as we all know, like, the hand is a super complicated structure. I mean, there's no question about it. The hand is just super, super complex. And so when you're drawing it, it's really tempted to want to add every last crease and every last fold, all of the little bends of the knuckles, all of the little creases on the back of the knuckles, and pretty soon your hand looks like it belongs to like an 80-year-old man instead of, this 19-year-old girl. Now, if you're drawing an 80-year-old man, that's great. If you're not, though, knowing where to eliminate lines can be really helpful. And sometimes I'll even do that between fingers. So for example, if you've been watching this channel for a while, I've been working on all of these portraits for our game, but I thought I would pull this one up as an example. You'll notice that here I drew Violet's hand. Of course, she's this young, beautiful girl, and I didn't want her hands to be super liney. And so I simplified them, and I didn't even put lines between her fingers. I suggested them here, but I let the shadows do the rest of the work. I did not carve out each of these individual fingers. I did not draw out all of her knuckles. I just kept it very, very minimal, and then I let the shadows and the light do the rest of the work to sort of define the form. You'll notice I did something similar here because I'm drawing really little kids and I don't want their hands to look like they belong to adults. I eliminated a bunch of lines. I mean, I have this one major knuckle crease here and then this line here to define the side plane of the hand, but that's really it. I don't have any wrinkles on the palm, no creases on the thumb. This one has slightly more because he's making a fist, which is a more extreme gesture. But as you can see, this little girl hardly has any definition in her hands at all because she's just, a very little toddler. She's probably about 2 or 3. And so I basically did the outline and just kind of let the light and shadow do the rest of the work. Here's another sketch where I went really minimal on the hands. Right here, as you can see, I sort of define a gap between the fingers there, but that's really it. I mean, I let the light plane do its work on the top, and then have shadow on the other planes, and that's really it. I hardly draw any lines, in there. However, if I'm drawing like an older person, like this gentleman right here, I add a lot more lines to my hands. I still try not to go overboard, but as you can see, I've drawn lots of craggy lines here for the knuckles. I've defined those really fine bones in the hand, and it just gives him more of a feeling, you know, of age, basically. So let's review those tips again. So number 1 is to look for clumps in the fingers. About 80% of the time, they will form into 3 clumps comprised of your thumb being one clump, your pointer finger or your index finger being another clump, and then the last 3 fingers, your pinky, your ring finger, and your middle finger, being comprising one clump. Sometimes they clump differently to where you have, you know, 2 fingers doing the same thing and then another 2 doing more the same thing, but fairly often that will be the pattern. Next, to pay attention to the actual anatomy of the hand, how the fingers are actually blocky and square, and to use the knuckles so that you can get those angles correct. And to notice how the fingers actually plug into the wedge of your palm. They don't just sit on top, but it's like they're plugged in like a power cord. My next tip is to pay attention to wrist placement. Your wrist is not directly in the middle, but your thumb actually hangs out over one edge, and you can exaggerate that if you want. My next tip is to pay attention to gesture, to use the gesture of the arm and trace it through the pointer finger to get a nice fluid gesture. And also to pay attention to the fact that fingers curve in. They are very rarely super rigid. They tend to curl toward each other or curl inward. And my last tip is to pay attention to what you can leave out. If you can eliminate lines and it makes your hands look more fluid and youthful, then do it. If you need to add more lines to make them look more aged, then do that. But there's no hard and fast rule that says you have to draw every line of the knuckles and every crease on your palm in order for a hand to be believable. So pay attention, try different things, and see which one communicates the idea that you are trying to share. I think that about does it for me today. Thank you so much. Let me know if this tutorial has helped you. And of course, as always, let me know below in the comments if you have any questions or if there's anything else that you want me to discuss. I will be back again next Friday with another video, so until then, enjoy the rest of your week.